Welcome to What's Up with Catalight, a podcast designed to raise the many important voices that are helping to shape the future for people with autism and IDDs by challenging the status quo. Your host, Dr. Lindsey Sneed, dives into the thought-provoking topics happening in the industry and at Catalight, from advocacy to research to treatment options and more. Tune in to discover how Catalight's innovative treatment options are pressuring industry-wide change and shining a spotlight on care that's shaping the landscape for individuals with developmental disabilities. This is What's Up with Catalight.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of What's Up with Catalight. I'm your host, Dr. Lindsey Sneed. Today's guest is someone who's reshaping how we think about brains, behavior, and bias. Dr. Gina Rippon is a cognitive neuroscientist, author, feminist, and maybe the world's foremost leading voice on challenging outdated ideas about gender and neurodiversity. She's a professor emeritus at Aston University in Birmingham, England, and she wrote The Gendered Brain in 2019, where she unpacks how neuroscience has been misused to reinforce harmful stereotypes. Her latest book, released in April, is called Off the Spectrum here in the United States. It's published in the UK as The Lost Girls of Autism. So I just happened to be perusing through a bookstore shortly after it was published, and the title caught my eye, and I decided to pick it up, and I'm so glad I did. I read through it very quickly, and essentially it has aligned perfectly with what I've been experiencing as of late as a diagnostician and a therapist. So the book really shines a spotlight on the generations of autistic women and girls overlooked by the traditional diagnostic models. So Dr. Rippon, she is a fierce advocate for evidence-based thinking, a champion for equity in neuroscience, and we're so thrilled to have her on the show today to talk about how science can do better. Welcome, Dr. Rippon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited. So I just want to start off with what inspired you to write Off the Spectrum? Was there a particular moment or observation that sparked it? Or do you feel like it was just a natural progression from Gendered Brain in your previous work? Because upon reading this book, I'm like, man, it's such important work, and I'm so thankful that you did.
Well, in fact, it I don't know if it's a natural progression from the Gendered Brain, but it was a progression or a response to some of the feedback I got from the Gendered Brain, because effectively what I had to say alongside many other colleagues was that this really outdated idea of the female brain and the male brain needed revisiting. Yeah. And I looked at the evidence and said, we really need to forget this idea. Can we please stop talking about the female brain? And as you can probably imagine, it didn't go down well in quite a few circles, although others welcomed it. And so I and people like me were dubbed feminazis and sex difference deniers, etc. Yeah, so, but one of the pushbacks came from actually research into different types of health, particularly brain health, and particularly people looking at brain-based conditions where it appeared there were sex differences. So, for example, in Alzheimer's, more women than men are diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And therefore, the suggestion was that people like me who were saying, we should, or they thought we were saying we shouldn't be doing sex differences research, were complaining because they said we must do this kind of research. And in fact, we were never saying that. We were saying, in fact, the research is so important. We must do it really well.
Yeah.
And in particular, because of all sorts of stereotypes and policy decisions based on this research, appealing to researchers to be careful what they said about it and to think about how many people might hear it. But if you looked at the top two of the male-based conditions, where they said these are conditions which are much more often common in men, and again, we should make sure we're doing the research to find out why. Mm. And autism and Parkinson's disease were always at the top of any list associated with that. So I thought, fair enough. I still am, in fact, an autism researcher. Sure. So I really ought to, look at what I'd been saying more generally about how it applied to my own work.
Yeah.
So I then started diving into what kind of research there'd been in sex differences in autism, particularly related to neuroscience research. And as you know from the book, what I uncovered made me think, well, if I'm going to write a book about that, it's going to be really, really short, because actually we haven't been doing any work, because the whole system has been biased by this belief that autism is a male problem, and therefore we don't need to look at women.
Yeah. And I was reading Jennifer Cook's book, Autism in Heels, and she brought up this point as I was literally reading it last night about how about heart disease in particular, and how like when women are having a heart attack, it's actually qualitatively different than when men are having a heart attack or are experiencing heart disease. And it's not that, well, I guess a better way of saying it is we just need to look at women and look how different it is and understand it better. And in my clinical experience, it's been the last few years have been marked by this significant increase in autistic youth who are women and adult women coming into my clinical practice seeking diagnostic clarification actually for autism and ADHD, or I should say, or ADHD, because they've been so missed. And then when you look at it, you look at the traits and it's like, oh yeah, that's clearly autism. It's just not presenting in the same way that how it always presents or how it presents typically, I should say, in males. And Jennifer Cook in her book, she was talking about how, thinking about lining up trucks, for example, and she was reflecting how she's like, but I didn't have trucks to line up as a kid. So, that trait was missed. And like, if you looked at other things that I might have lined up, like shoes, maybe you would have seen it and like not been so stereotypical. And how, for me as a diagnostician, how I view these things, I'm so fascinated by this phenomenon.
Well, I think, the heart attack issue is very interesting because, again, there have been other books looking at unwell women and the fact that, there was assumed that there was a kind of default male. And if you had a heart attack, it presented the same. And people were starting to, they knew women had heart attacks, but they assumed it was, the symptoms were the same. Autism is slightly different because there was an assumption that women weren't autistic. So it wasn't as though they were assuming, they were unconsciously assuming a default male. But the overall picture was always that very few women presented as autistic, and that was the accepted picture. And there was even in some of the biological sciences a search for the female protective effect, because there was such a strong belief that women weren't autistic that they thought, there must be something about being female which is protecting them from autism. At one level, you see that women's biology gets a pretty bad press. So if there's anything which suggests that it's a good thing, you should perhaps not challenge it. But obviously one can't do that with for something like autism. But it was very much, right from the beginning and still. I think we're starting to change now a bit.
Yes.
But it was always the idea that autism was a boy thing, and if you Google it, it's all about boys.
Yeah. I've been working in the field of autism in intervention and diagnostic clarification and therapeutic methods and research for going on 18 years or for 18 years, I somewhere around there. And I started working with young autistic children in 2007. And all the individuals that I worked with for 5 years were males.
Boys.
I didn't meet my first autistic female clinically until 2012. So 5 years. And when I did meet this autistic individual who I was working with therapeutically, she also had a co-occurring intellectual disability and had severe aggression. So she was on the spectrum, but she presented more severely, if you will. She had that cognitive disability co-occurring with her. And so then in my mind as a clinician and what I had been told, basically by the field is that, with women or with girls, if they do have autism, it's usually with co-occurring intellectual disability. And we just don't see as many autistic women who are quote unquote high functioning. And in your book, I was reflecting on those beliefs, and that it's been such an interesting journey for me as a clinician to walk through this, because what you've described is what I've experienced clinically. And I do think there is a change happening right now, but there's a lot of catch-up work to be done.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think it's intriguing that two things that you said there. First of all, about the male-female ratio is almost invariably quoted at about 4:1.
Yes.
Historically, it's often been higher, particularly when Asperger's syndrome was added into the mix, as it were. And we're looking at 12, 13, 14, 15:1. So it's still reliably quoted. And certainly as an autism researcher writing academic papers, you almost always, every academic paper you look at, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, 4 times more common in boys than girls, etc.
Yes.
So except at the, I don't like to use lower, the one end of the spectrum, where there is co-occurring intellectual disabilities, where the ratio is almost 1:1. Which starts one thinking about, is there a kind of female protective effect, which, if without an intellectual disability, do you have the wherewithal to devise the kind of strategies, survival mechanisms that we now know are more common among autistic women? So I think that's true. Yeah. Yeah. I think the idea that something is changing, I think for me, came very much through the autistic autobiographies, like the Autism in Heels that you mentioned, because I think that the kind of, for me, the sea change occurred when all of these biographies started coming out, very articulate, hugely insightful descriptions of lifelong struggles with decades of misunderstanding and misdiagnosis. And then suddenly somebody realized that, you were autistic. And, they said at last, my life made sense. So there was a big, I think I called the chapter Here Come the Girls, which was, the idea that people, they got together and said, there are autistic women and here we are. And lots of us waited decades to be diagnosed. And there's invariably many, many more who haven't been diagnosed.
Yeah. Yeah. On this topic, can you talk about the ways autistic girls and women often camouflage their traits? This is something I see clinically a lot, particularly in the last few years, where I'll have women and girls coming in and, again, saying, like, I've been living this way. I've been hiding, like, my traits, or hiding, I think, a big part of who I am for a long time. And I'm depressed and I'm anxious, and I don't feel like I fit in any social circles. And then as we start unpacking that, I, start discovering this idea of camouflaging. And the individuals I'm working with may not say that particular word, but talking about how, like, just trying to hide or fit in their social circles.
Yeah. Oh, I think that was the core of the realization of what was going on. And again, partly it came from these autobiographies. I think way back in the 1980s, Lorna Wing, or maybe Judith Gould, I can't remember, may have sort of speculated, because about that time, the diagnostic definition of autism was made much wider. So there were many more cases emerging, not so many girls. And I think it was Lorna Wing who said, maybe girls are just better at camouflaging or masking their symptoms. And it wasn't really pursued. It was just, maybe there are girls, but they're flying beneath the radar kind of thing. But I think once it became clear what was happening, that was the kind of core breakthrough for realizing how and why women had been overlooked for so long, because they were masking their symptoms, and the descriptions given of how exhausting this masking or camouflaging was. So, for example, camouflaging is where you try and blend in, a bit like, the moth on the tree bark kind of thing. So you think, I never seem to understand how social situations work. So if I study them intensely and I generate a script and I watch facial expressions and gestures, then I go home and I literally practice the scripts,
literally practice.
Copy the, gestures, facial expressions in the mirror. Then maybe I'll blend in and people won't notice that I'm weird, because one of the saddest things I found was that talking to quite young autistic girls, or girls whose parents thought they might be autistic but were really struggling to get any acceptance of that from clinicians, GPs, etc.
Yeah.
Was that these young girls are bullied. They're othered, they're called weird, and they really mind. So they do everything they can from quite a young age to work out what to the neurotypical world seems on the other side of the mirror, if you like, seems completely automatic. They don't have to think about it. They just, as they grow, they kind of learn how to blend in. So the need to do that made people realize that there was something different about this group, most of whom are female, but not all, because there are boys who mask as well and who mind. And it was the minding that really triggered my thinking, because I thought, well, we've now got descriptions of how these people are masking. And there's, generating questionnaires about do you mask and how do you mask, and even self-help books about, dropping the mask, etc. But there didn't seem to be a question about why they masked, because the traditional picture of autism was that actually you didn't have much concern about social affective contact. And, the idea of the kind of aloof loner was so firmly embedded that nobody seemed to think, if these people are autistic, they're certainly not behaving like aloof loners because they really want to belong. Yeah. And I think that was what set me off on the kind of, put me back on the neuroscience trail, thinking, well, obviously there's not, initially I started saying, well, this is where neuroscience should be looking. And that's when I uncovered those pretty horrendous statistics about 30 years of men-only research in neuroscience research into the autistic brain.
Yeah. Yeah, and you described an experience that I've had probably with every single autistic woman I've worked with, of trying to camouflage, thinking like maybe I'm doing it right, and then somehow they're not doing it right. They're not camouflaging correctly, and it comes across odd to people. And then they're bullied. Women, like women in in jobs or school or, whatever it is, and they're bullied. And then it causes this cycle of no longer wanting to be social because they've tried so hard and they're being diminished for their efforts time and time again.
Yes. I mean, the personal stories are really distressing, particularly with older women who've maybe suffered from abusive relationships, etc., because the need to belong is so strong, and the kind of lack of social instinct is so difficult for them to realize, this isn't a normal relationship. This isn't how things should work. Yeah. The stories are very sad. And certainly the description of, unfortunately, female bullying is heartbreaking in some cases, that the quite young girls being bullied by other girls not actually as a sex difference denier, but trying to say not all girls are like this and not all boys are like that. I have to say, when I looked at the stories about the bullying, there did seem to be a particular characteristic of bullying which was more true of girls than it was of boys.
Yeah, the bullying can be so covert. A lot of women, what they've described to me is not realizing for some time that they're being bullied, and it taking like some extreme things happening within these relationships, or other people pointing out how they're being mistreated. to understand. And now of course, there's other things to be unpacking in these experiences that they've had with this cycle of bullying. Yeah. And I've had a lot of women go through and decide, like, reflecting back on those experiences throughout their lifespan, that like, maybe there's just something different about me. And I want to understand it better. And then they go to a clinician and they're like, oh no, you're not autistic. You're too whatever, too successful. You're too social. You have too many strengths. Whatever it is, like there's so many different things. And then they've had this experience of being diminished. Then they go to a clinician of some sort to get clarification about their lived experiences. And then they're further diminished. And that's been something I've heard, I mean, from so many women who go on to be diagnosed with autism. And it's like, not only are they diagnosed, but like if you dive in and seek what's going on and dive into their passions and what they're interested in, it's actually very clear. You just have to spend the time with the individuals to unpack all of those things.
And the trouble is that, sorry.
No, go ahead. I mean, it's been devastating for these individuals.
Yeah. I think the trouble is that the so-called gold standard autism tests don't actually allow you to dive in. I think that's the trouble.
Yeah.
That they've got the evidence of the male bias in the observation schedules and the questions that are asked in interviews is becoming more and more clear. But, a good clinician, particularly to ensure consistency and validity, etc., should stick quite closely to the guidelines, because otherwise, you'll get huge amounts of variation from clinic to clinic. So there is this, what somebody described to me as the cold dead hand of ADOS, the autism diagnostic schedule, which probably wouldn't go down very well with the creators of that. But it's because it doesn't allow you to dive in. So you get, yes, do you have friends? Yes. Next question. And not diving into how hard was it to get those friends, or, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Or like, do you have friends? And then you find out that they have a friend, and that friend has been their friend forever. And then as you start to hear about the traits of that friend, you're like, I wonder if they're also on the spectrum.
Yes.
Because they get along so well and they have similar interests. And an area that I've experienced clinically, and then reading your book and reading other books, that I actually find quite incredible, is I've never met an autistic person ever who didn't have a particular passion or significant interest that they had a lot of knowledge about. And that's male or female. I've just never come across an individual who didn't. Something that's so fascinating is that with a lot of girls and women, there could be very stereotypical interests. And so people are like, oh, that's just what they're experiencing.
Yes.
Or they're just really interested in that thing that's like gender normative. I've had individuals who I've worked with who are incredible, are so interested in clothing, and are fashion designers and are very successful. But then when you dive into it and you start asking, I can just ask one question about clothing, for example, and they will start talking to me about the clothing in such elaborate detail. And I can't even follow, not because I'm not interested, but because their depth of understanding of the topic is so intense and so nuanced, that it's like, wow, they understand that to a degree that is far above and beyond than anything I have an understanding of. So fashion design, or makeup, or the chemistry behind cooking. Those are just some of the things that I've been experiencing clinically. And it's like, wow, they have a lot of knowledge about this. Or particularly with young girls, of something that I've seen more than a few times is Disney princesses and the knowledge of Disney princesses and the lining up of Disney princesses and like just the depth of understanding of their stories. And so what comes across as very like gender normative interests is kind of what other people are saying, well, they can't be autistic. They really like this thing. That's not like a train or a wheel.
Yes, or a, calendar dates or something. Yes, I mean, or Barbie dolls, yes. And again, it's the kind of thing, I think Tony Attwood, the Australian psychologist, ages ago was saying, well, girls have socially acceptable obsessions. So everything there is to know about a particular boy band or ponies and all girls like those kind of things. So it's kind of, put to one side. And because that's a key aspect of an autism diagnosis. And similarly, the kind of stimming, the, repetitive is self-stimulating behaviors, which actually they do to calm themselves down or when they're anxious, they repress them. So, it's much more obvious in the traditional picture with the hand flapping or the rocking or the spinning, etc. And it turns out that these masqueraders, camouflagers, have exactly the same needs, but know that it's not acceptable. So they'll find a way of hiding it, which is distressing and exhausting and why they have the problems they do.
Yeah. Are there any other traits that that you're consistently seeing being overlooked in the diagnostic tools within autistic women and girls?
Well, one of the things which is interesting is sensory sensitivities, which have only in the last iteration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 2013, they've only just been added as a diagnostic clue, if you like, and certainly much more closely related to the neuroscience research that I've been doing, much more common in females. Which again, you think, if this is a characteristic of a female type of autism, but it hasn't been part of the diagnostic category, then, that's another reason that they've been missed. And I think that's quite intriguing too, because lots of the interviews I had, when I said, what's it like to be you, which seemed to me a better question, I realised I've just written a piece for The Psychologist in the UK saying that we've had this sort of autism from an observer's perspective view in research. So an autistic, researcher will have a list of this is what autism is like, and therefore you test their perception. Are they very good at paying attention to detail, or do they not? Do they only focus on close detail and not the big picture, etc. But they don't say to the autistic participant themselves, how was your day? What do you find most difficult in your day? And one of the things I found with females was scratchy clothes, scratchy labels in clothes, and particularly the girls, and the agony of wearing, if they had school uniform or they were made to wear certain kinds of clothes, bright lights, sounds of people chewing in restaurants, loud noises, all of those seem to be more characteristic of what I call the chameleon masking type autism and more common in females.
Yeah. No, I did, like, from a clinical perspective, I'm definitely experiencing that. And I have, again, more than a few autistic women and autistic girls who are youth, who the sensory environment is so overwhelming that it's actually easier for them to stay in their home. And they stay in their home because the sounds, the smells are so overwhelming, and their way of coping is to not leave their house, the safety of their house. And there's other things caught up in that as well. But the sensory aspect of their experiences has really, really stood out to me. For one, it was, I learned that there was one individual I was assessing, and this young woman really loves teas. And recently, one of the coffee shops in our area switched their cups that they use to serve their tea. My client was devastated by this because she loved the tea and she could no longer drink it because she couldn't handle the cup, the texture, like the new cup. And she's like, it made it smell different. It made it taste different. I can't handle the texture in my mouth of the cup. And it was truly devastating for her because she really loves teas. And I was like, oh my gosh, like what, like how difficult to like go through life having something that you love and no longer being able to enjoy it because somebody decided they were going to change the cups without telling anybody.
Yeah. It's a bit like the story of the overlap between eating disorders and autism, particularly in girls.
Yes.
And when you, again, do the deep dive, which obviously you know about, very often it is to do with sensory aspects. They don't like foods of a particular colour, or they don't like foods of a particular colour being on the same plate as other foods. They don't like wet food touching dried food. So when they present with eating disorders and immediately get a diagnosis of anorexia or something, and then sent off to inappropriate treatment interventions, it's to do with the sensory aspects, which unless you experience it, or with experience like yours, you often hear it, that you don't realise how incapacitating it can be. If that's so important to you, then you can't eat if somebody gives you a plate of food with something which isn't beige. Okay, the beige diet is quite popular.
More.
No,
I was just going to say that bringing up like the rise of ARFID and we're seeing that significantly a lot in women.
Yeah.
And it's truly devastating. And I've talked to lots of individuals who even the sight of certain foods will cause them to gag and throw up. And so they can't even have the food in their home. Or there's a billion other things that you just described, like the colors, the textures that cause a lot of interference. And there was one young woman I was talking to where she was explaining that she's a foodie. She loves food. She's constantly thinking about food because she's so nervous that if she were to go to a place that didn't have a food that she could eat, that it's distressing. And so she's almost obsessed with food, not wanting to be obsessed with food because she likes the taste of certain foods, but it has to be done in a really, really particular way.
And it's not just being fussy, which, is very often the kind of accusation that you grow up and eat what's put in front of you kind of thing.
Wow.
And I mean, a story somebody was telling me once about her daughter-in-law, I think, who wanted things to be really organized. And she was on a train and had put her suitcase in a rack and had put it so that the side of the case was lined up very carefully. And at the next stop or whenever, a whole load of other people got on and they pushed all their suitcases into where hers was, and it moved hers. So it was at an angle. And the rest of the train journey, she was in real pain because she was so anxious. But she didn't want to make a fuss, characteristically, get up and put her suitcase where she wanted it. So she just sat in real distress for the whole of the rest of the train journey because her suitcase was at an angle. And you just think, that experiencing the world differently in that way is really hard to comprehend until somebody tells you about it. And almost invariably, if they're, the people we've been talking about, people who mask, they won't tell you about it because they kind of feel ashamed. They seem to feel ashamed that, I shouldn't be like this. Other people don't seem to mind if their suitcases are at an angle or their books aren't lined up in colour order or height order or something.
Yeah. What other ways that you see societal expectations around gender playing a role in shaping how autism is expressed and perceived in girls and women in particular?
Yeah. I think that's really important to try and understand. And there was certainly a suggestion some time ago, which has developed a bit since, that gendered socialization had a big role to play in the apparent absence of women from the autism statistics, because it was felt that autistic behavior was something that was very externalizing. It was, loud, possibly aggressive, unusual behaviors. But if, as a girl, anyway, any kind of girl, as it were, you were very from an early age, good girls they sit quietly, they don't make a fuss, they don't make a noise, they don't upset people, they try and blend in, then already you've got a kind of training regime in place, which stops the girls revealing, the problems that they're having. So I think gendered socialization has a lot to say for it. But it could also be, and this is where the second book is a bit of a step away or of a different version of the first book. It could be that maybe autistic women have a much more sensitive socialization radar, for example. So they're much more anxious to be good girls, to receive the messages, etc. So maybe there is some kind of inbuilt socialization responsiveness or something, to try and think of a word of describing it, which is what drives these autistic women underground. I mean, I talked about that in the book. And also, as a whole, because we know that if you look at the kind of characteristic mental health problems, the gender differences, that women's problems are much more internalizing. So they're much more likely to turn difficulties in and not express them. And so you've got depression, anxiety, self-harm, etc., as opposed to the kind of externalizing aggression, substance abuse, etc., which is more characteristic of males. So it's not just in autism, but in autism, particularly because of the kind of social aspect, it plays out in a much more intense way.
Yeah, it really does. There's a mental health crisis in general, but the mental health crisis amongst autistic people is starkly more devastating.
Really?
It's very, very intense, and the rates of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and death by suicide, are really high amongst autistic individuals.
And that's increasing dramatically in your experience. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. And thankfully, there's research looking into this, trying to understand it better. But one thing that has come up is the camouflaging in autistic women and the higher rates of anxiety and depression.
Yes.
And, that's being investigated presently. And the research that has come out thus far has shown that amongst women, it's higher. And there's that more anxiety and depression. I know you've been doing some book festivals and making some rounds since your book's publication. Yes. What kind of feedback have you received so far from maybe autistic individuals, clinicians, researchers, or others?
Right. Overwhelming, actually.
I bet.
Especially people have got very good at finding your contact details. So I've had lots and lots of really nice messages. I mean, there's been a bit of pushback from I'll talk about it separately. Mainly really positive.
Okay.
I haven't yet had a book signing queue, which sounds a bit weird, where somebody hasn't been in tears and said, thank you so much for this book. I wish I'd had it, 20 years ago or something.
Yeah.
So it's obviously, people are really saying, thank you for saying this, because nobody's listened to me before, which is very pleasing, because you kind of think, am I just writing this for myself? Is it a kind of intellectual exercise? I'm problem solving or something. So the fact that it appears to be making a difference. So I've had some very, very sad tales, but also some just very nice thank yous, which is good.
Yeah.
There is a slightly different pushback. I don't know if it's playing out over there, but the overdiagnosis debate, the suggestion that, it's been part of physical medicine, and there are various books have come out about that, saying that, are we making people ill? By now we have cancer screening, and we've got concepts like pre-diabetes and pre-cancerous cells, etc. If we tell people, give them a diagnostic label, you are pre-diabetic or something, does that then does that worry them? Does that turn them, give them an illness identity? But the language associated with mental health problems is nothing like as compassionate. It's actually, some of it is really toxic. There was an article in an English newspaper called "We Fetishized Mental Illness, so now we all want some." So the idea is that, because mental health issues is now the greatest reason for workplace absences in the UK. I don't know if it's the same in the US. Wow. And so people are saying there's too much of this autism diagnosis, literally. And so then I'm getting into trouble by saying, why you encourage women to seek an autism diagnosis? We've already got, too many autistic people. There's been a 800% increase over the last 20 years or so. And, what is the point of, one woman was told, why do you want an autism diagnosis? There's no cure. So that's the more unpleasant side of it, which isn't necessarily to do with the book per se, but it does throw a very worrying spotlight on attitudes towards mental illness. I mean, Sick Note from Life was in another article which said people wanting a depression or anxiety or autism or ADHD diagnosis were just saying they couldn't cope with life, or the unspoken was they didn't want to. So that was one aspect too, which is very sad, I think.
That is really sad. And, I shared this with you before that, like, just clinically, what I've been experiencing particularly these last few years is autistic women, girls and women, coming in for diagnostic clarification. It is significantly higher than my male patients. I think right now it's like a 10-to-1 ratio. Like I have so many more referrals for autistic youth, particularly young girls or older girls actually, over the age of 14 and then into adulthood, being like, there's something going on, right? And, it's a story I'm seeing over and over and over again from what I've experienced clinically and therapeutically with these individuals is they just want to understand themselves better. Yeah. They just want to, they want to understand themselves better. They want to have more acceptance and understanding for who they are and find their people. I have found that a lot of autistic people just want to also hang with other autistic people because they there's like this mutual understanding. As a psychologist, like I don't want to diminish that at all. Like I want these women to come in and feel loved and accepted for who they are and get that understanding. And I don't know if I've had for adult women in particular, I don't think I've ever had an experience that doesn't end in happy tears when you provide the diagnosis. Like, you've been right this whole time. There is something different about you, and it's called autism. Yeah. Which a lot of them already know, but they just wanted that additional clarification, and they are in tears, just so happy for the understanding that, one, they're validated, and two, that like I understand myself more fully.
Yeah.
It's quite a beautiful experience, actually.
Issue of, yes, it must be. It's the issue of identity and the, finding my tribe, etc.
Yes.
So almost the first response, certainly the people I was speaking to, and obviously the late diagnosed women who had a diagnosis, quite often in the context of having an autistic child. And when they went to the clinician to discuss autism, and the clinician was saying, this is what autism is like, and the mother would say, but that's me.
Yeah.
And, so then they go, first of all, happy tears, but then actually some of them very angry, because particularly those who had been trying or had had all sorts of support from their family to say, well, let's see if we can get some help for you. And they'd been turned away time and time again, or been told they got borderline personality disorder, whatever that is.
Yes.
That just seems like a real dustbin. It's not my area of expertise, but it seems like a real dustbin sort of diagnostic label. We don't know what they are, so we'll say they're borderline personality disorder. But and then they say, so my life would have been so different if somebody told me that before. And they're not seeking anything because people that the overdiagnosis brigade are saying, they're taking resources away from people who need it. Why do they want to know this anyway? And even with parents of young children, do you want to tell your child that they've got an incurable brain disorder, quote? And you just think, well, that's not what's going on. And you don't, if you think that's, if that's how you do your diagnosis, then you really need to rethink your activities. But yes, I think the identity issue ties in well with the statistics with gender variance as well, because autism seems to be so much associated with identity confusion or a history of unsettled identity.
Yeah.
And so it ties in with the sort of gender variance story a lot, which again, a bit like the eating disorders, is something that, that overlap could be very informative, both for the issue of gender variance and for the issue of autism.
Yeah. As our time together comes to a close, how do you hope your work changes the lives of autistic women and girls in the years to come?
Well, I think if there's people like you out there, some of it's happening, which is great, which is just understanding, I think, raising awareness. I mean, one particular campaign I'd like to get involved in is early years education, because very often, the very earliest point at which somebody could be identified as experiencing the world differently is in schools. Yeah. And the teachers still have, autism is a boy thing. So if a girl presents with problems, then she'll grow out of it, she's shy or whatever. So it's a kind of missed opportunity. So those are the kind of differences. But I think so much of it has come from raising, and I think that's what the increase in diagnosis is about. It's not that there's more autism, it's that we're more understanding of what autism is like. But until recently, we weren't understanding of the fact that the reason it was less common in females was not because it was less common in females, but because people weren't aware that, it presented, autism presented in females, but in a different way. And we've been blinkered. As I said in my book, as a neuroscientist, I was part of the problem I was hoping the book would solve. So, and certainly the neuroscience community are really forging ahead. So an understanding at that level, even though that's been criticised as medicalising the problem, I think that's, so I think we're moving in the right direction. The fact that we're having this conversation, which hopefully people are listening to, will actually move things on a bit. Yeah. And also give the families of autistic girls or autistic girls and women themselves the ammunition to stand up and say, I think I might be autistic. Yeah. And I'd like, validation for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I resonate with that. And as a clinician, I know I was part of the problem, and I hope to no longer be part of the problem, but be part of the direction of advocating for autistic women and girls. Yeah, because for so long, I had that idea that it was predominantly a male condition.
And you were probably, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy because you were getting referred more boys than girls. So that must be right. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So breaking that vicious cycle hopefully will be.
Yeah, we need to name it and break it, break that cycle. I think that's so important. And why I'm so thankful that you're here today. So seriously, Gina, just a huge thank you for joining me today and for challenging us to rethink how we understand brains, gender, and neurodiversity. I just really appreciate it.
Right. Well, thank you for the great questions. They're
really
good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, for our listeners, if you want to dive deeper, be sure to check out her books, The Gender Brain, and especially Off the Spectrum. There are links in the show notes, so you can access those. They're truly excellent reading for anyone working in autism, IDD, or just trying to make sense of the world through a more inclusive lens. On a more personal note, this episode marks the 1-year anniversary of What's Up with Catalight. We're recording today on June 23rd. Our first episode launched on June 24th of 2024 after really a lot of work and planning. So it's been a really amazing year. For me, having the privilege of hosting the show, we've come a long way and there's so much more to be said and done. So thank you so much to all of our listeners who have been here since episode 1 and those listening for the first time now. Your support really means everything to us. So as always, if you've liked today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, and share the episode. That would be very lovely. It helps others find us and join the dialogue. Until next time, keep asking better questions and keep pushing for better care.
This has been What's Up with Catalight, hosted by Dr. Lindsey Sneed. Now you know what's up with Catalight.